Yezhov vs. Stalin, The Causes of the Mass Repressions of 1937-1938 in the USSR. Grover Furr. This article outlines the causes of the mass repressions of 1937-1938 in the Soviet Union. Primary source evidence strongly supports the hypothesis that these repressions were the result of anti-Stalin conspiracies by two groups, which overlapped somewhat: the political opposition of supporters of Grigory Zinoviev, of Trotskyists, of rightists, and of military men, and higher-ranking party leaders, nominally supporters of Stalin, who opposed the democratic aspects of the Stalin Constitution of 1936. It discusses Stalin's struggle for democratic reform and its defeat. The prevailing anti-Stalin paradigm of Soviet history is exposed as the reason mainstream scholarship has failed to understand the mass repressions, misnamed Great Terror. Introduction. On February 25, 1956, Nikita S. Khrushchev delivered his secret speech to the delegates at the 20th Party Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. In it, he attacked Stalin for committing a number of crimes against members of the party. Khrushchev stated, "It was determined that of the 139 members and candidates of the party's Central Committee who were elected at the 17th Congress, 98 persons, i.e., 70%, were arrested and shot. Of 1,966 delegates with either voting or advisory rights, 1,108 persons were arrested on charges of anti-revolutionary crimes." Now, when the cases of some of these so-called spies and saboteurs were examined, it was found that all their cases were fabricated. Confessions of guilt of many arrested and charged with enemy activity were gained with the help of cruel and inhuman tortures. Khrushchev claimed that Nikolai Yezhov, the commissar of the NKVD from August 1936 until November 1938, must have acted under Stalin's orders. It is clear that these matters were decided by Stalin, and that without his orders and his sanction Yezhov could not have done this. Journal of Labour and Society 2471-4607 Volume 20 September 2017 pages 325, 347 volts 2017 Emmanuel Ness and Wiley Periodicals Incorporated. The Great Terror. In 1968, British writer Robert Conquest published a book titled The Great Terror, Stalin's Purge of the 30s. Conquest relied heavily on Khrushchev-era books and articles, which he cited without source criticism, as though the claims made in them were unproblematically accurate. Conquest's book proved to be of enormous value as anti-communist propaganda. Scholars of Soviet history began to employ the Great Terror as a designation for this period of Soviet history. The Anti-Stalin Paradigm. The goal of my recent book, Yezhov vs. Stalin, is to identify the causes of, and properly locate the responsibility for, this mass repression. Historians of the Soviet Union have proposed several different explanations. My research concludes that all of them are fundamentally wrong. These historians have in fact not been trying to discover the causes of the mass repressions. Instead, they are groping for an explanation that fits the dominant historical framework, or paradigm, for this period. I call this the Anti-Stalin Paradigm. The proximate origin of the Anti-Stalin Paradigm is the writings of Leon Trotsky. In service to his own conspiracy, Trotsky depicted Stalin as a monster. Today, we know that Trotsky lied about virtually everything that concerned Stalin and the USSR. In his secret speech, Khrushchev took up a number of the same falsehoods that Trotsky had invented. At the 22nd Party Congress in 1961, Khrushchev and his men accused Stalin of yet more crimes. From 1962 to 1964, Khrushchev sponsored hundreds of articles and books attacking Stalin. These were avidly repeated by Western anti-communist writers. Between 1987 and 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev sponsored yet another avalanche of anti-Stalin writings. These contributed significantly to the ideological dismantling of the Soviet Union. Today, we know that Khrushchev's and Gorbachev's men were lying in virtually everything they wrote about Stalin. According to this anti-Stalin paradigm, Stalin was a dictator. Therefore, he must have initiated, or at least could have stopped, everything important that occurred. Whatever happened, happened because he wanted it, or something very like it, to happen. Stalin was always in control. The alleged conspiracies against the Stalin government were all fabrications. The evidence produced in the testimony at the Moscow trials, and in the interrogations and confession statements that have gradually been published since the end of the USSR in 1991, must be fabrications too. Most mainstream historians of the Stalin period bind themselves a priori to these tenets. They are not questioned, nor is there any attempt to validate them. These strictures dictate the kinds of explanations and the types of evidence that are deemed acceptable. Their purpose is to guarantee that the only historical explanations set forth in mainstream historiography are those that make Stalin and the USSR look bad. They are convenient to the view of the USSR as totalitarian, a dictatorship ruled by terror. They reinforce the concept of this period as the Great Terror. These are disabling assumptions. Accepting them makes it impossible to understand Soviet history of the Stalin period. But their aim was never to facilitate a truthful account of history. Rather, their purpose is to reinforce an anti-communist, virtually demonized view of Stalin and the USSR, and thereby of the world communist movement of the 20th century. Books about the so-called Great Terror continue to appear. A recent example is The Great Fear: Stalin's Terror of the 1930s by British historian James Harris. Harris's tone is moderate and, for the field of Soviet history, relatively non-judgmental. However, in common with all other mainstream academic historians of this period, including the Trotskyist historians, Harris ignores all the evidence that proves that the massive executions were not Stalin's doing but the product of Yezhov's conspiracy. Harris endorses the long disproven story of the German plot to frame Marshal Tukhachevsky, repeats the similarly disproven tale that Yezhov's murderer was almost certainly acting alone, and decides, in the face of all the evidence, that the fears of challenges to the Stalin government were false. The keystone questions concerning the mass repressions known as the Great Terror are these: 1. Was Stalin responsible for the murders of hundreds of thousands of innocent persons, as is usually claimed? 2. If Stalin was not responsible, how were Yezhov and his men able to go on killing so many innocent people for over a year? Two sets of events are crucial to understanding these mass repressions. The first is Stalin's struggle for electoral democracy and its defeat. The second is the interlocking conspiracies involving supporters of Grigory Zinoviev, of Leon Trotsky, of Nikolai Bukharin, Genrikh Yagoda, Nikolai Yezhov, and many others, called the Rights, and of military figures, of which the Tukhachevsky affair is the best known. Elections during 1930s, the Stalin leadership was concerned to promote democracy in the governance of the state and to foster inner party and trade union democracy. In December 1936, the extraordinary Eighth Congress of Soviets approved a draft of the new Soviet constitution that called for secret ballot and contested elections. Candidates were to be allowed not only from the Communist Party but from other citizens' groups as well, based on residence, affiliation, or workplace organizations. But this last provision was never put into effect. Contested elections were never held. The democratic aspects of the constitution were inserted at Stalin's insistence. Stalin and his closest supporters fought tenaciously to keep these provisions. He, and they, yielded only when confronted by their rejection by the party's Central Committee, and by the panic surrounding the discovery of serious conspiracies that collaborated with Japanese and German fascism to overthrow the Soviet government. In June 1934, the Politburo assigned the task of drafting a new constitution to Avelin Yukidze, long a leading figure in the Soviet government. Some months later, Inukidze returned with a suggestion for open, uncontested elections. Almost immediately, Stalin expressed his disagreement with Inukidze's proposal, insisting on secret elections. In a dramatic interview of March 1, 1936, with American newspaper magnate Roy Howard, Stalin declared that the Soviet constitution would guarantee that all voting would be by secret ballot. Voting would be on an equal basis, with a peasant vote counting as much as that of a worker, on a territorial basis, as in the West, and direct. All Soviets would be elected by the citizens themselves. We shall probably adopt a new constitution at the end of this year, as has been announced already. According to the new constitution, the suffrage will be universal, equal, direct, and secret. Stalin also declared that all elections would be contested. Different citizens' organizations would be able to put forth candidates to run against the Communist Party's candidates. Stalin told Howard that citizens would cross off the names of all candidates except those they wished to vote for. Stalin also stressed the importance of contested elections in fighting bureaucracy. You think that there will be no election contests, but there will be, and I foresee very lively election campaigns. There are not a few institutions in our country which work badly. Our new electoral system will tighten up all institutions and organizations and compel them to improve their work. Universal, equal, direct and secret suffrage in the USSR will be a whip in the hands of the population against the organs of government which work badly. In my opinion, our new Soviet constitution will be the most democratic constitution in the world. Stalin insisted that Litiantsy, Soviet citizens who had been deprived of the franchise, should have it restored. These included members of former exploiting classes such as former landlords, those who had fought against the Bolsheviks during the Civil War of 1918, 1921, and those convicted of certain crimes, as in the US today. Important among the Litiancy were the kulaks, former rich peasants who had been the main targets of the collectivization movement a few years earlier. These electoral reforms would have been unnecessary unless the Stalin leadership wanted to change the manner in which the Soviet Union was governed. Stalin wanted to get the Communist Party out of the business of directly running the Soviet Union and return all power to the Soviets, a Bolshevik demand of 1917. The anti-bureaucracy struggle. The Stalin leadership was also concerned about the party's role. Stalin himself raised the fight against bureaucratism with great vigor as early as his report to the 17th Party Congress in January 1934. Party leaders controlled the government both by determining who entered the Soviets and by exercising various forms of oversight or review over what the government ministries did. Stalin, Molotov, and others called the new electoral system a weapon against bureaucratization. Speaking at the 7th Congress of Soviets on February 6, 1935, Molotov said that secret elections will strike with great force against bureaucratic elements and provide them a useful shock. Government ministers and their staffs had to know something about the affairs over which they were in charge, if they were to be effective in production. This meant technical education in their fields. But party leaders usually made their careers by advancement through party positions alone. These party officials exercised control, but they themselves often lacked the technical knowledge that could make them skilled at supervision. This is, apparently, what the Stalin leadership meant by the term bureaucratism. Though they viewed it as a danger, as, indeed, all Marxists did, they believed it was not inevitable. Rather, they thought that it could be overcome by changing the role of the party in socialist society. The concept of democracy that Stalin and his supporters in the party leadership wished to inaugurate in the Soviet Union would necessarily involve a qualitative change in the societal role of the party. Those documents that were accessible to researchers did allow us to understand that already by the end of the 1930s determined attempts were being undertaken to separate the party from the state and to limit in a substantive manner the party's role in the life of the country. Article 3 of the 1936 Constitution reads: in the USSR all power belongs to the working people of town and country as represented by the Soviets of Working People's Deputies. The Communist Party is mentioned only in Article 126, as the vanguard of the working people in their struggle to strengthen and develop the socialist system and is the leading core of all organizations of the working people, both public and state. That is, the party was to lead organizations, but not the legislative or executive organs of the state. At the June 1937 Central Committee plenum, Yakov Yakovlev, one of those who had worked on the draft of the new constitution, said that the suggestion for contested elections was made by Stalin himself. This suggestion met with widespread, albeit tacit, opposition from the regional party leaders, the first secretaries. After the Howard interview, there was not even nominal praise or support for Stalin's statement about contested elections in the central newspapers, those most under the direct control of the Politburo. Pravda carried one article only, on March 10, 1936, and it did not mention contested elections. From this historian Yuri Enzukov concludes, this could mean only one thing. Not only the broad leadership, but at least a part of the Central Committee apparatus, Agitprop Understetsky and Tal, did not accept Stalin's innovation, did not want to approve, even in a purely formal manner, contested elections, dangerous to many, which, as followed from those of Stalin's words that Pravda did underscore, directly threatened the positions and real power of the first secretaries, the central committees of the national communist parties, the regional, oblast, city, and area committees. Senior party leaders were usually veterans of the dangerous days of Tsarist times, the revolution, the civil war, and collectivization, when to be a communist was fraught with peril and difficulty. Many had little formal education. It appears that most of them were unwilling or unable to remake themselves through self-education. All of these men were longtime supporters of Stalin's policies. They had implemented the collectivization of the peasantry, a step essential to escape the cycle of famines, during which hundreds of thousands of kulak families had been deported. They had been in charge of crash industrialization, under necessarily severe conditions of poor housing, insufficient food and medical care, low pay and few goods to buy with it. Now Stalin was threatening them with elections in which persons formerly deprived of the franchise because they had opposed these Soviet policies would suddenly have the right to vote restored. They feared many would vote against their candidates or indeed any party-backed candidate. Stalin himself put it even more strongly: if the people here and there elected hostile forces, this will mean that our agitational work is poorly organized, and that we have fully deserved this disgrace. This was Stalin's position. The first secretaries opposed it. Did they consider Stalin's proposal to be a violation of the dictatorship of the proletariat? Did they regard it as too great a concession to capitalist concepts of democracy? Even in the most democratic of capitalist states, avowed enemies of capitalism are not permitted to participate freely in elections unless pro-capitalist parties have overwhelming advantages. And even in those states the system itself, capitalism, is never up for grabs. Conspiracy. The bloc of oppositionists, while the Congress, which had opened on November 25, 1936, was attending to the new constitution, the Soviet leadership was between the first two large-scale Moscow trials. Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev had gone on trial along with some others in August 1936. The second trial, in January 1937, involved some of the major followers of Trotsky, led by Yuri Pyatakov, until recently the deputy commissar of heavy industry. At the public Moscow trials of 1936, 1937, and 1938, the prosecution charged that a clandestine criminal bloc of the various opposition groups was formed in 1932, had murdered Yezhov, and continued to conspire against the Stalin leadership. From exile, Leon Trotsky vigorously denied that he and his followers had joined or ever would join such a bloc. But in 1980 Pierre Brouet, at that time the most prominent Trotskyist historian in the world, discovered that this bloc did in fact exist and that Trotsky had approved it. On December 1, 1934, Sergei M. Yezhov, first secretary of the Leningrad Oblast and City Party committees, was murdered in party headquarters at the Smolny Institute in Leningrad. The Stalin-led Soviet government stated that their investigation proved that the assassin, Leonid Vasilyevich Nikolaev, had acted on behalf of a secret Zinovivist group. Trotsky claimed that Stalin was lying. Khrushchev's and, later, Gorbachev's men claimed that no secret Zinovivist group existed and that Nikolaev had been a lone assassin. Western anti-communist scholars either echo Khrushchev and Gorbachev or claim that Stalin had Yezhov killed. Thanks to evidence from the former Soviet archives and the Harvard Trotsky archives, we now know that the Stalin-era police and prosecution were correct. At the first Moscow trial in August 1936, Zinoviev and Kamenev confessed to collaborating in Yezhov's murder. They admitted that the goal of the bloc of oppositionists, including Zinovivists, Trotskyists, and others, was to seize power in the USSR by violence. Other Trotskyists confessed to plotting assassinations of Soviet leaders, including Stalin. The defendants in the 1936 Moscow trial had disclosed the existence of a parallel leadership for the bloc and had named Trotskyists and Rightists as participants. Trotskyists named included Karl Radek and Yuri Pyatakov. Rightist leaders named included Mikhail Tomsky, Alexei Rykov, and Nikolai Bukharin. Between September and December 1936, Radek, Pyatakov, and others involved with them revealed details about Trotsky's conspiracies with Germany, Japan, and with anti-Soviet and pro-fascist forces inside the USSR. At the second Moscow trial of January 1937, the defendants detailed Trotsky's plans to dismantle socialism in the USSR in exchange for German and Japanese support in seizing power. They implicated Bukharin, Rykov, and other rightists as members of the bloc who were fully informed about Trotsky's plans. The February to March 1937 plenum of the Central Committee, the longest ever held, dragged on for 2 weeks. This plenum dramatized the contradictory tasks that confronted the party leadership, the struggle against internal enemies, and the need to prepare for secret, contested elections under the new constitution. The discovery of more groups conspiring to overthrow the Soviet government demanded police action. But to prepare for truly democratic elections to the government, and to improve in a party democracy, a theme stressed over and over by those closest to Stalin in the Politburo, required the opposite: openness to criticism and self-criticism, and secret elections of leaders by rank-and-file party members. Leningrad party leader Andrei Zhdanov spoke about the need for greater democracy in the country and in the party, invoking the struggle against bureaucracy and the need for closer ties to the masses, both party and non-party. The new electoral system will give a powerful push towards the improvement of the work of Soviet bodies, the liquidation of bureaucratic bodies, the liquidation of bureaucratic shortcomings, and deformations in the work of our Soviet organizations. And these shortcomings, as you know, are very substantial. Our party bodies must be ready for the electoral struggle. In the elections we will have to deal with hostile agitation and hostile candidates. Zhdanov spoke out strongly for democracy in the party as well. This meant secret ballot re-election of all party organs from top to bottom, periodic reporting of party organs to their organizations, strict party discipline, and subordination of the minority to the majority, and unconditional obligatory decisions of higher bodies on all party members. He complained about co-option to party bureaus rather than election, and candidates for leading positions being considered behind closed doors, in family order. When he called this familyness, Stalin interjected, "It is a deal." This was our virtual declaration of war against the regional clan leaderships, and their reaction in the discussion to Zhdanov's report showed that they were angry. Nikolai Shvernik, representing the Stalin leadership of the party, issued a strong call for democracy in the trade unions. Shvernik argued that the unions, like the party, lacked internal democracy. One should say here, directly and with all frankness, he explained, that the unions are in even worse shape. With the development of new industries during the first 5-year plan, the country's 47 unions had split into 165, creating thousands of new jobs. Positions at every level were filled by appointment, rather than election. Shvernik concluded his speech with the suggestion that elections were needed not only in the party, but in the unions as well. Party secretaries' fear of elections. Zhdanov's report was drowned out by discussions about enemies. A number of first secretaries responded with alarm that those who were, or might be expected to be, preparing most assiduously for the Soviet elections were opponents of Soviet power. From the beginning of the discussions, Stalin's fears were understandable. It seemed he had run into a deaf wall of incomprehension, of the unwillingness of the CC members, who heard in the report just what they wanted to hear, to discuss what he wanted them to discuss. Of the 24 persons who took part in the discussions, 15 spoke mainly about enemies of the people, that is, Trotskyists. They spoke with conviction, aggressively, just as they had after the reports by Zhdanov and Molotov. They reduced all the problems to one, the necessity of searching out enemies. And practically none of them recalled Stalin's main point, about the shortcomings in the work of party organizations, about preparation for the elections to the Supreme Soviet. Most threatening for all party officials, including first secretaries, Stalin proposed that each of them should choose 2 cadre to take their places while they attended 6-month political education courses. With replacement officials in their stead, party secretaries might well have feared that they could easily be reassigned during this period, breaking the back of their families, a major feature of bureaucracy. This proposal of Stalin's was ignored. The courses never took place. During the next few months, Stalin and his closest associates tried to turn the focus away from a hunt for internal enemies, the largest concern of the CC members, and back toward fighting bureaucracy in the party and preparing for the Soviet elections. Meanwhile, local party leaders did everything they could within the limits of party discipline to stall or change the elections. But a very ominous period loomed. In late March 1937, Genrikh Yagoda, former head of the NKVD, was arrested. In April, he began to confess to having played an important role in the secret bloc of oppositionists that had been the main target of the first and second Moscow trials. The Politburo had planned for the constitutional reforms to be the central agenda item at the upcoming June 1937 plenum. But by June, the discovery of plots by the former chief of the NKVD and by top military leaders to overthrow the government and kill its leading members had changed the political atmosphere entirely. In a June 2 speech to the expanded session of the Military Soviet, Stalin portrayed the series of recently uncovered conspiracies as limited and largely successfully dealt with. At the February to March plenum, he and his Politburo supporters had minimized the first secretary's overriding concern with internal enemies. But the situation was slowly, but decisively, getting out of his control. Between the end of the February to March 1937 CC plenum on March 5, 1937, and the opening of the June CC plenum on June 23, 1937, 18 members of the Central Committee and 20 candidate members were arrested for participation in anti-Soviet conspiracies. Their expulsions were approved at the June plenum. The conspiracies were genuine. On June 17, 1937, just prior to the June CC plenum, Nikolai Yezhov, who had replaced Yagoda as commissar of the NKVD, transmitted a message from S.N. Mironov, NKVD chief in Western Siberia, reporting the threat of revolts by subversives in concert with Japanese intelligence. Mironov reported that Robert Iake, party first secretary of Western Siberia, would request the ability to form a troika to deal with this threat. On June 19, 1937, Stalin received a telegram, addressed to the Soviet government, sent by Trotsky from his exile in Mexico. In it, Trotsky stated that Stalin's policies would lead to external and internal collapse. On it Stalin signed his name and wrote, "Ugly spy. Brazen spy of Hitler." It was also signed by Molotov, Voroshilov, McCoy, and Zhdanov. Clearly, they all believed that Trotsky really was in contact with the Germans. Given Tukhachevsky's confession and Marshal Budenya's comments on the Tukhachevsky trial, there can no doubt that this conspiracy did exist. Anti-Soviet conspiracies. No transcript of the June 1937 plenum has been published. However, Yuri Zhukov quotes extensively from some archival transcript materials. We also have a conspect of the remarks Yezhov made. It is dated June 23, which would make Yezhov's remarks the first report of the plenum. Yezhov's report was extremely alarming. He listed a dozen active conspiracies, concluding, "The above is a list of only the most important groups." Elections. Yakovlev and Molotov criticized the failure of party leaders to organize for independent Soviet elections. Molotov stressed the need to move even honored revolutionaries out of the way if they were unprepared for the tasks of the day. He emphasized that Soviet officials were not second-class workers. Evidently, some party leaders were treating them as such. According to the surviving agenda of the CC plenum, Yakovlev spoke on June 27. He exposed and criticized the failure of first secretaries to hold secret elections for party posts, relying instead on appointment. He emphasized that party members who were elected delegates to the Soviets were not to be placed under the discipline of party groups outside the Soviets or by party superiors and told how to vote. And Yakovlev referred in the strongest terms to the need to recruit from the very rich reserve of new cadre to replace those who had become rotten or bureaucratized. All these statements constituted an explicit attack on the first secretaries. Perhaps most revealing is the following remark by Stalin, as quoted by Zhukov, at the end of the discussion, when the subject was the search for a more dispassionate method of counting ballots, remarked that in the West, thanks to a multi-party system, this problem did not exist. Immediately thereafter he suddenly uttered a phrase that sounded very strange in a meeting of this kind: "We do not have different political parties. Fortunately or unfortunately, we have only one party." And then he proposed, but only as a temporary measure, to use for the purpose of dispassionate supervision of elections representatives of all existing societal organizations except for the Bolshevik Party. The challenge to the party autocracy had been issued. The constitution was finally outlined and the date of the first elections was set for December 12, 1937. The Stalin leadership again urged the benefits of fighting bureaucracy and building ties to the masses. But all this followed the unprecedented expulsion from the CC of 26 members, 19 of whom were directly charged with treason and counter-revolutionary activity. The party was in severe crisis, and it was impossible to expect that events would unroll smoothly. It was the worst possible atmosphere during which to prepare for the adoption of democratic, secret, universal, and contested elections. Causes of the repression. In common with most historians of the USSR, Yuri Zhukov largely discounts the existence of real conspiracies. He believes the NKVD's targets must have been Lizhensky, the very people whose citizenship rights, including franchise, had recently been restored and whose votes potentially posed the greatest danger to the first secretary's continuance in power. This may indeed have been one of the motives of some of the regional party leaders. But it should not simply be assumed, and as yet we have no evidence to support it. Other historians claim that this mass repression was led by Stalin, who was trying to kill anybody who might be disloyal, a fifth column, if the Soviet Union were invaded. Still others claim that Stalin was out to murder any and all possible rivals, or was paranoid, or simply mad. There is no evidence to support these notions. In fact, the reason for the campaign of repression stands out clearly in the evidence we have. The subversive activities and rebellions that Mironov, Ake, and other regional party leaders and NKVD men reported were a logical consequence of the conspiracies that had been gradually discovered since the assassination of Yezhov over the previous 21=2 years. Before Khrushchev's secret speech, few specialists in Soviet studies doubted the real existence of these conspiracies. Only the Trotskyist movement, faithful to their murdered leader, claimed that these conspiracies were fabrications by Stalin. This changed after Khrushchev's speech. Virtually all anti-communists, as well as most communists and, of course, all Trotskyists, chose to believe Khrushchev's allegations against Stalin. It followed from what Khrushchev implied in 1956, and from what his supporters claimed at the 22nd Party Congress in October 1961, that the defendants in the Moscow trials, plus the Tukhachevsky affair defendants, had all been innocent victims of a frame-up. Mikhail Gorbachev's lieutenants made the same assertions. Since Khrushchev's day, The consensus among professional students of Soviet history has conformed to the Khrushchev-Gorbachev position. There were no conspiracies, all were inventions by Stalin. This is all false. There has never been any evidence that any of these conspiracies were frame-ups or that any of the defendants were innocent. Just the opposite is the case. The evidence is overwhelming that Yezhov was indeed murdered by the clandestine Zinoviyevist group and that Zinoviev and Kamenev were involved in the group's activities, including Yezhov's murder. Trotskyists and Trotsky himself were also implicated. We have a great deal of evidence that the conspiracies alleged in all three Moscow trials were real and that all the defendants were guilty of at least what they confessed to. In some cases, we can now prove that defendants were guilty of crimes that they did not reveal to the prosecution. We also have a great deal of evidence on the Tukhachevsky affair. All of it supports the hypothesis that the defendants were guilty as charged. The evidence that all these conspiracies did in fact exist allows us to view the Yezhov mass repressions of July 1937 to October to November 1938 objectively and in their proper context.